I am not a scholar of Denise Levertov. I've taught her poetry a little bit, but I was so excited when Joe said that he wanted to use her work, particularly, is it The Streams and the Sapphire?
Right.
Yeah. And so I'm very thankful for Joe. Joe's been my second mentor in EFM, and those are two of my two men I honor very much, and very thankful to have had as mentors in that wonderful program. So Joe, I'm looking forward to you sharing with us what we need to know about Denise Levertov. Thank you for being here.
Yes. Well, I would not consider myself a scholar of Denise Levertov either, but I do love her poetry. So, I love to read poetry. I don't consider myself a scholar of poetry at all, or poetics. How the lines break, what a poet's thinking. I mean, all that stuff, I don't know. I just respond to what I respond to. And Denise Levertov is a poet that speaks to me, because she writes so much about spirituality as a pilgrimage, and she writes a lot. She wrestles a great deal with what she would say, and many people have said about her, about the paradoxes of faith. She, just a little bit about her background, and I'll say this: I envied Linda's comments about how her relationship with Ted Kooser developed, and her being able to have a correspondence with him, and that's just so wonderful. The video that Ted Linda shared with us about him was so wonderful. The sound quality and the videos for Denise they do exist, but they're not the best, and so I haven't included any of those here. But just a little bit about her background. She was born in 1923 in Ilford, Essex, in England. She was born to a father who was an Anglican priest who had converted to Anglicanism, having been born a Russian Hasidic Jew. I can't really tell you a whole lot about his journey, but I'm pretty sure that his is pretty fascinating as well. He was born at a time a little bit earlier than Denise Levertov was, and he was, like many in World War I and so forth, was put into ghettos with his Jewish compatriots, was imprisoned for a while, all of that kind of stuff. He ended up marrying a woman from Wales, and in a nod to being contemporary, her mother homeschooled Denise and her older sister Olga. Denise spent a lot of time reading poetry, having poetry read to her, reading literature, learning French, practicing art and ballet. That was how she was brought up. So her education was not all that uncommon for a child of an elite white person in England. But it was an education where she was brought up by her mother, who was very well educated herself, and internalized so much of all of that. She fell away from the church. She really wasn't all that interested in church. And so a lot of Denise's journey is her coming back to faith. She was very precocious. At age 12, she sent a group of her poems to T.S. Eliot and asked him to read them. And he did, and sent her back, as she said, a 2-page letter with many helpful comments, and encouraged her to follow her passion, and encouraged her to be a poet. So she took him up on that. She, let's see, she, at age 17, she had her first poem published. During World War II, remember that started when she was 16, 17. She served as a civilian nurse in London, and was subject to having bombs all around her, in the city of London. In 1946, she published her first book of poetry. And her poetry in the early days was very much nature poetry. It was very much traditional poetry in the sense that she focused on having her poems fit a particular meter, or rhyme scheme, all of that kind of stuff. And all of that was her growing up in England. In 1947, at age 24, she married a novelist, a would-be novelist named Mitchell Goodman, who wrote a book and was constantly working on his book and constantly getting rejection notices and so forth. And so she was married to him. They had one child, who ultimately was somewhat estranged from his parents, and so forth. Anyways, Denise and Mitchell moved to New York in 1949. They lived in the Village, and at a time when the Village was even more populated then than now, with poets and artists and all sorts of interesting folk. And she had many friends that she came along with. She developed like Linda did with Ted. She established correspondences with a number of well-known poets. She reached out to people who were principally American poets at that point. William Carlos Williams was one. She also reached out to, he's her main mentor. Even though he was a generation older than she, he took her under his wing. They established a great correspondence, and she was influenced very much by him. She was divorced in 1975. She had a hard time with that. She had been naturalized as a U.S. citizen somewhat earlier, and she really is considered an American poet rather than an English poet. And so I'm looking up at my bookshelf. I should really reorient my camera and everything to show you my bookcase, so everybody can. Anyway, but you've seen many bookcases for in Zoom meetings all for the last few months. But if you look at like the Norton Anthology of Poetry or the Oxford Book of American Poetry, you're going to find several pages devoted to Denise Levertov. And the pages that you're going to find are not her religious poetry, the ones that appear in the Stream and the Sapphire, at least not generally. But you're going to find that she is more noted for both her nature poetry and for her social activist poetry. Couple of examples are that she wrote significantly about the Vietnam War. She was against it. And she wrote against nuclear, she was very concerned about and wrote about nuclear warfare. And one of her poems is a poem about her visit to a nuclear test site with Dom Camara Helder, who was one of the Catholic archbishops in Brazil. who is very well known. I remember, I guess, back in the last Christian formation program that we've had that's an alternative, well, not an alternative, but, another, program other than the Dean's Forum. We talked about the Beatitudes and Jesus's teaching in the early Gospel of Mark. And the verse that I got to talk about was be peacemakers, blessed are the peacemakers. And Camera Helder is one of the leading peace writers and peace activists from that time. So it was interesting to see that connection as well. So, so around the time of the Vietnam War, all of this time, Denise had been really divorced from not only her husband, but also from religion. She wasn't interested in the church. She, even though she, had grown up with her father and her mother, both of whom were very active and alive spiritually, she just didn't, she saw that more, her life was more interesting about, like I say, nature and anti-war involvement, activism, those kinds of things. And she came to see that there was a big connection between nature and anti-war activism and spirituality. And so she started to reflect on that, not so much to become an Episcopalian or a Catholic, although she ultimately converted to Christianity and became a strong member of a Roman Catholic church in 1989. After having converted to Christianity in 1984. But she spent the last 10 or 15 years of her life, she died in 1997, spent the last 10 or 15 years of her life largely, writing poetry about her journey of faith, her search for God, and for her concern about what she saw in the world, and her musings about doubt and faith. And so if any of you have any, spiritual path where you see the journey, see Christianity as being on a journey or a pilgrimage, if you ever have any doubts, and I would count myself among those who do, then Denise Levertov is someone that you might want to look at, because she writes movingly and deeply and very intelligently about those topics. Toward the end of her life, she wrote an article, an essay called "Work That in Faiths," and she noted with some despair that she had never outgrown her ample doubt, and she lamented that she did not have the burning surety of faith. I'm all in favor of both of her comments about those things. But rather what she does is she searches for the fragments of light that exist in the world, that she sees in nature, that she sees in others, and that speak to her through her poetry. So I don't know if that I can't possibly do what Douglas Dupree did last week talking about W.H. Auden. But to tell you the truth, all I really got away from that is that Auden has a very craggy face. So I'm sorry, I just maybe I was not in the right mood for that. So anyways, I don't know, Owen, if you want to put up the little PowerPoint thing. I think I've mentioned some of the people who were influences for her. She considered her main poetic influence. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Great, thanks, Zoe. Some of her main influences, her main influence for as a poet is Rilke. She also loved and was mentored by William Carlos Williams. Linda, you may know a Canadian poet named Margaret Avison, whom she considered to be the direct heir of George Herbert, who Tim Toller talked about so well a few weeks ago, and then Gerard Manley Hopkins. She also knew Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, and a number of folks who are Catholic, principally Catholic, social activists and anti-war activists. One of the first quote that's up on the screen, I do not believe that a violent imitation of the horrors of our times is the concern of poetry. Horrors are taken for granted. Disorder is ordinary. People in general take more and more in their stride. The hides grow thicker. I long for poems of an inner harmony in utter contrast to the chaos in which they exist. Insofar as poetry has a social function, it's to awaken sleepers by other means than shock. Now that's interesting because fairly soon after that, she would write a good bit about the Vietnam War. And there are a number of people who can, in the academy, I guess, who consider her to be a little too pronounced about her writings about the war, and she suffered academically as a result of some of the stances that she took. But she did not shrink from writing about the horrors that she decries here in this first paragraph. Just another quote from her that talks about her religion. For her, religion is the impulse to kneel in wonder, the impulse to kiss the ground, the sense of awe, the felt presence of some mysterious force, whether it be what one calls beauty, or perhaps just the sense of the unknown. And I don't mean unknown in the sense that we don't know what the future will bring. I mean the sense of the numinous, whether it's in a small stone or a large mountain. That quote, for me, kind of summarizes and encapsulates what Denise Levertov was talking about, particular for her poetry, particularly about spirituality and her religion. So, if you'll, Owen, if you go to the next slide, this poem, Overland to the Islands, I start out pretty much every morning after I've had breakfast, if I have the luxury of doing that, walking our Brittany Spaniel. And this poem explains exactly what those walks are like and how that ties into what it means to be a poet and how poetry is. So I would love to hear somebody else's voice. Dee, would you mind, if you wouldn't mind, would you read this poem for us?
Let's go, much as that dog goes, intently haphazard. The Mexican light on a day that smells like autumn in Connecticut makes an iris ripples on his black gleaming fur. And that too is as one who would desire a radiance consorting with the dance. Under his feet, rocks and mud, his imagination sniffing, engaged in its perceptions, dancing edgeways. There's nothing the dog disdains on his way. Nevertheless, he keeps moving, changing pace, an approach but not direction, every step an arrival.
Thank you. And so what I would like to do is I'm more interested in what y'all have to say about this than what I can say. I can tell you a couple of things. One is that this is exactly how our Brittany goes about his walks, every one of them. Nothing is outside his attention. He disdains nothing on his way. He always is moving. Even when he's sniffing and it appears that he stopped, he's moving. And so for Levertov, this is a 1958 poem, so it's fairly early in her career. this is exactly how she goes about doing it. And for her, she recommends for herself and for poets that, you know, she needs to be like the dog who goes intently haphazard, and disdaining nothing. The last line, every step in arrival, is nicely quoted because that's a quote from Rilke in his Letters to a Young Poet. And so it's a nod to him. Any thoughts about her language, her thought about poetry? If not, we'll move on, but I value your thoughts. And it, being an EFM mentor, I can be quiet for quite a long time.
Well, I really like, I get up every morning and walk our dog as well. And I don't know, there's just something that you do see the spiritual in the ordinary. You know, you think, oh, it's just a dog walking and sniffing. But if you observe that, and as she did, it opens up a whole conversation with nature, with your spiritual being. But you're paying attention to these details, possibly.
Yep. Absolutely. Thank you. Any others?
Joe, one question I had, she talked about early on the Mexican light.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Did she spend time in Mexico, or just how would she have?
Actually, I hadn't even thought about that, but yes, she did. She and her husband fairly early moved or lived in Mexico because he was a failing novelist, if you will. They didn't have a lot of money. And so they were constantly on the lookout for the cheapest places they could find to live that would be interesting. And so one of the places that they spent a summer was in, my Mexican pronunciation is really bad, but in Oaxaca, Oaxaca, that beautiful little city in Mexico. So yeah, they do. Yeah, they did. Thank you.
Joe, I find it interesting that when Jean Kate does her morning prayers, her dog goes in the bathroom waiting for her to take you for a walk.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows the routine, and he has to go in there first to wait. I love that.
And I can absolutely believe that. Yeah, our dog is very much a creature of habit, and it sounds like hers is as well. So,
This also reminds me, our son, sometimes he'll have a bad day at work, and he said that he comes home and his dogs are the best antidepressant ever. He said, you open the door, they come at you like you are the sun rising, the stars in the sky. They're so happy to see you. They can't get close enough to you. Their little tails are wagging. They're just so happy. And he said, all of a sudden, all of that clutter from my day just dissipates. And here I am with these happy people that are just showing love. So that kind of reminded me of this dog isn't going to let things get him down.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of the whole volume of poetry that Mary Oliver wrote, her dog stories. So those are great as well. Highly recommend those. Owen, could you move to the next slide? Okay, so the book that I was that we'll focus on, or the poetry that we'll focus on in just the minutes that we have left, I'll just quickly say that The Stream and the Sapphire was from, this says 1975. Let's see, let me check my thing. I don't think that's right. Well, okay. The reason it's 1975 is because that's when some of her poems that came from this actually started. But this was written, or The Stream and the Sapphire is a collection of poems from her last 7 or 8 regular volumes of poetry. And she designed this, as she said in her foreword, just real quickly, she said, this volume is conceived as a convenience to those readers who are themselves concerned with doubt and faith, and though they read a wide variety of poems, like to have a focused single volume at times, to stuff in a pocket or place at their bedside. And you can see from the size of this, it fits in a pocket beautifully. She used it for retreats, and you know, maybe one of these days we should have a retreat focused on Denise Levertov's poetry. If we did, this would be the book that we would probably use. I have some people I have in mind to be the retreat leaders. It isn't me. So, but in her book, she divides her poems into 4 sections. The first section is called The Tide, and I've given us a couple of examples from The Tide, and you can see, you know, the tide comes in, it goes out. And doubt and the journey of faith is very much like, for her, maybe for you as well, like a tide. The first or the poems, most of which are in this section, are dealing about doubt and faith and the paradox of spirituality and so forth. The next few poems in the section are called Believers, and we'll read one from that. There's also one that I'll mention real quickly about called The Annunciation, which is the last poem in the section of the Believers. And I don't know about y'all, but what the poem is about the angel appearing to Mary and telling Mary, you're going to have this baby and it's going to be Jesus and all of this. And the poem basically says, you know, she had a choice. She didn't have to do this, but she gladly and silently, without gritting her teeth, but with joy and wonder, said, okay, I'll do that. So I don't know if you're of the view that Mary had the ability to say no, you know, when the angel came to her and asked her to bear this amazing gift. That makes perfect sense to me. I don't think God forces us to do anything. Anyway, Denise certainly didn't either. The third the third section is Conjectures, and you can imagine what that might be. There's one poem that we have from that, and then the last one is A Fish and a Honeycomb, and they are about Jesus and parts of things. And it's interesting to me. I looked this up because I wanted to make sure. But A Fish and a Honeycomb. This is from the 24th chapter of Luke, and you'll remember that when Jesus appears in one of his post-resurrection experiences, he's on the beach and he says, you know, do you have anything for me to eat? And they gave him. And most of the translations say they gave him some broiled fish or they gave him some fish. Well, in the King James Version, they gave him a fish and a honeycomb. I don't know what happened to the honeycomb. I don't know where that came from. I don't know any Greek. We should ask Dean Kate, you know, where did that come from? But that's what that's about. And so that's the translation that Denise was mostly looking at. She would have been quite put out with the NRSV and the NIV and you know, the Message and all that, all of which only talk about giving Jesus a fish. The first poem is probably about the only, well, we'll talk about this. The first one is Of Being. And I wonder, Clarence or Velda, or would you be willing to read that one for us? If you unmute.
Okay, now that I've unmuted.
There you go. Thank you.
I know this happiness is provisional. The looming presences, great suffering, great fear, withdraw only into peripheral vision. But interlocuble, this simmering of wind in the blue leaves, this flood of stillness widening in the lake of sky, this need to dance, this need to kneel, this misery.
Thank you. Any thoughts about that? I love this poem. Mm-hmm. Obviously, she starts out in the first few couplets, talking about the happiness that we can have in this world is provisional, and we can, always in our peripheral vision, we can see all kinds of bad stuff. We can see that all day long. Looming presences, great suffering, great fear. but ineluctable the shimmering of wind in the blue leaves, this flood of stillness widening the lake of sky, this need to dance, this need to kneel, this mystery. You'll note that the poem ends in a colon. It doesn't end in a period. And there are, and so what she basically said was, that's as far as I could get it. I couldn't explain it in English any language better than that. So I had to stop, with the colon. I don't know of other poems that end in a colon. Perhaps y'all do. Y'all are more scholarly and know a lot more about poetry than I do, but I don't know of any other ones. But she did this obviously by design. Ineluctable, in case you're wondering what that word means, because I wanted to look it up and see, but ineluctable is something that is, the facts it's inescapable. You cannot get away from this. So many times in our current political discourse, facts are thrown about, but the facts are really the facts. And for her, what's ineluctable is the shimmering of wind in the blue leaves.
Which is, I think, as much a part of the peripheral vision as the looming presences and the great suffering and the great fear. I love that balance.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
thus, the colon at the end of Mystery, at the end of the poem, is, which will it be for you?
Yeah.
What is in your peripheral vision?
Yeah, I like that. Well, for her, it was both. I mean, you could never get away from either one of these things. But if you're aware, and she promotes awareness, then you won't be able to escape the shimmering of wind in the blue leaves. Just no more than you can escape the looming presences. So I like that. And this was one of her earlier poems, in her move, or her journey toward spirituality, her journey toward the religion as she defined religion. So the next one gives a little bit of an idea. Catherine, I don't know, would you like to read that? Would you read that one for us?
Sure. As swimmers dare to lie face to the sky, and water bears them, as hawks rest upon air, and air sustains them, so would I learn to attain free fall and float into Creator Spirit's deep embrace, knowing no effort earns that all surrounding grace.
Thank you. Thoughts? Elaine, how about, I'm sorry. Yeah, Catherine?
Just that I loved that imagery. I would learn to attain free fall and float, because that's, we've all seen birds flying in the sky up and down, and that is, it reminds me of that I've seen.
Yeah.
Both of these kind of, we live on we're blessed to live on the intercoastal. And so some days when I get all revved up and anxious about the virus and who's going to get it and who's going to die, and I see all the things on TV that just tears at my heart, I'll look out and I'll see the waterfowl. And there's a little rabbit that lives out here. And I think, they're not worried about this virus. They're going on their merry way. They're enjoying life. They're enjoying the water, the air, the grasses. Maybe I should be more like the birds and the rabbits. And don't you think that's kind of what she's saying here? Maybe?
I certainly, yeah, absolutely. I also look at this as, I kind of think of, Peter getting out of the boat and walking on the water until he realizes what he's doing. And so, rather than floating into Creator Spirit's deep embrace, all Peter could really do is to cry out for help. And of course, that was available as well. But knowing that no effort earns that all surrounding grace. I mean, this is, God is there, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not, whether we deserve it or not. So I don't know. There's a lot there. Let's move to the next slide. And these two poems are, and of course, as usual.
Joe,
yes.
Bill Courtney has something to say.
Oh, absolutely, Bill. Yeah.
Can we back up one? You all are way more versatile in matters of language and spirit than I am. I tend to be a boring economics and finance kind of person, so I don't have the language to speak, much less contemplate such things. But let me ask you all. I'm wrestling with a couple of words and concepts in the avowal. So help me think about this for a minute. So in here we talk about, it is talked about the water bearing the swimmer, the air sustaining the hawks. And I understand the all surrounding grace, but I keep wondering what this free fall seems to me to be the opposite of bearing and floating. Can you all help me think about that? Is free fall just a concept of just allowing the of just existing in some state of nature? I don't get what is free fall. Just what does that mean in that poem?
Well, the fact that you have the question to me means that she's achieved her purpose of asking you to think about what does that mean.
Yeah.
I wouldn't presume to tell you what it means. I don't think that's what she's getting at. That may be a very unsatisfactory answer.
Nah.
But the idea of thinking, gosh, I wonder what it means. I wish, or sustain. So would I learn to attain free fall and float into Creator Spirit's deep embrace? The free fall is a free fall into that deep embrace.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
At least that's the way I'm thinking, understanding what she's getting at. And so just like the water bears the swimmer and the air sustains the hawk, the Spirit's embrace will embrace and hold us just like the water and the air does.
Yeah.
I don't know. At least that's what I'm getting out of it. But there may be other ways to look at it as well. But I think the fact that you had the question, I think that's the main thing.
But it,
Anyway, that's my.
She often uses mystery, Bill. So she understands how water holds up the body, and she understands how air holds the birds.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a mystery for her in terms of how God embraces us when we leap toward God. And I remember reading Teresa of Avila one time, and I said to my spiritual director, he was French. He said, "Oh, Linda, you are like Teresa of Avila." It's like, nope, I'm not. I'm never going to have that kind of wild abandon to God. It's too scary for me. So I have learned to trust a little more, but it's that kind of, I'm going to leap and God's the one catching, but I'm not sure how that happens. Grace is not as clean sometimes as water or air.
For me, it also means that word, I think of surrender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Giving, letting go and surrendering.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have an image in my mind of a riptide at the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And this might not be accurate, but this is my memory of some instruction or something that I made up over my lifetime about fighting a riptide, that you could, completely exhaust yourself trying to fight it. But the way to survive it is just to let it carry you for a while until you're out of the, I would say, the concentration of the energy. And then you can come back to shore. So it made me think of that a little bit.
Well, I will say that I like that very much because to me, that's you're putting your ordinary life. I mean, and I don't mean that in any pejorative sense, but your ordinary life, your normal life, your normal experience, and saying, how is that a metaphor for, the spiritual life?
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. You should write poetry.
Right.
Well, and I'm so glad you said that, because I was puzzled just before the free fall. So would I learn to attain free fall? Because you get the idea that free fall is spontaneous, there are no rules, you're just floating. But then she brings in, I've got to learn to do that, which comes up to Bill's comment about the riptides. If you get taken out, you need to know. That needs to be something you've learned. Go with it for a while. I mean, do you not, I was wondering about that. What do you think? Why do you think she said, so would I learn to attain free fall?
Well,
She might have been thinking about Peter, because Peter surely had learned to trust Jesus. And yet, when he doubted, he no longer floated. This is an incredibly relevant poem considering the gospel that we're getting ready to read in church.
I think another thing too is that when we learn things, you don't know if you've really learned something until, in Bill's case, you get caught in the riptide and you say, okay, I know what I'm supposed to do because I've learned that. It's just intuitive to me at that point. If I have to learn and try to recall, what the lessons were, or if I resist and say, okay, I'm in this riptide, but I don't know, it doesn't really seem like, even though I learned that I'm supposed to, just go with it, I don't know that that's what I'm really going to do. And so I think when I learn to attain free fall, I think, to me, there's a large element, like Catherine said, of surrender, and a large element of trust. But, trust is we say we learn to trust. Well, that's really not that easy to do. And when we find that we're in a situation where we need to be trusting, sometimes we resist that. I'm just speaking from my own experience. So. Well, guys, it's about 9:45, and so I don't want to keep you. But I do. But if you found this of any value, then I would you might look at the poem "Flickering Mind," which applies to me very definitely. Lord, not you, it's I who am absent. Those kinds of things. And she refers to herself as the minnow that darts away, darts into the shadows. But yet you are the stream, the fish, the light, the pulsing shadow. There's just so many wonderful metaphors and turns of phrase in that. And incidentally, the last phrase, how can I focus my flickering, perceive at the fountain's heart the sapphire I know is there. So part of the, well, this volume is taken from from the last few lines of this poem. The next poem, The Beginning of Wisdom, well, I won't try to, summarize it. It has the notions, I'm so small, a speck of dust moving across the huge world. Linda, you'll remember that Marilyn Nelson, whom we just listened to on Own Being, talks about the spirituality of dusting. And when you realize that dust is, specks of matter from a comet or from the beginning of the universe, you have a whole different view of, well, should I even be going about doing the dusting and everything? My wife wouldn't like that, but anyways, so there's that. The next poem, which is about the servant girl at Emmaus, is based on a painting. You'll remember that Douglas told us about a painting about the Bruegel painting about Icarus, and at the margins of the painting, at the margins of people's consciousness. Here, the servant girl at Emmaus is the one who recognizes Jesus before those who were walking along with Jesus and having the scriptures expounded to them, and they didn't recognize Jesus until he broke bread with them. Here, the servant girl is saying, I know this guy. I know it because I've seen him before, and his eyes just, bore into me. I mean, it's that kind of thing. And anyways, I hope that I'll stop it at that point. There's several more poems. They're wonderful. I didn't even get a chance to. I'll just tell you real quickly. The parable of the mustard seed. It's a wonderful poem. That's just awful comment. But the next one, one more, Owen, I'm sorry, is on a theme from Julian's chapter 20. And this is a poem that, to me, bears a lot of further comment, because it talks about how Jesus on the cross, he says, well, what's so special about that? I mean, people have died and suffered for longer periods of time and more than Jesus did on the cross. But then she says, well, but wait a minute. And then she remembers how Julian's vision, one of the showings to Julian of Norwich, was of Jesus on the cross. Well, several of her showings were of Jesus on the cross. And she talks, and Julian's had her mind opened to see, and you'll see this on the right-hand side of the page, the wanting, and that's Julian's term, the wanting with the Godhead opened him, Jesus, utterly to the pain of all minds, all bodies, sands of the sea, of the desert, from the first beginning to the last day. The great wonder is that the human cells of his flesh didn't explode. And so she talks about why it was that Jesus's suffering and death on the cross was of such great, why it was so special. Well, anyway, you may not need to be convinced of that. But if you had any wonders about that, particularly if you've seen war, if you've seen people suffering from the COVID, if you've seen any number of things where people are suffering, well, okay, what is it about Jesus' suffering that was so special? Well, this gives you at least one example or one reflection of why that was the case. The last slide on this is all about making peace. And so I thought, even though that's not from The Stream and the Sapphire, it's from one of her late volumes, and it talks about how peace, I'm looking at the second stanza, but peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself. It can't be imagined before it's made. It can't be known except in the words of its making. Grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid, a feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. And it goes on to talk about how it's up to us to make peace. And we'll know what it looks like when we work for it and when we speak it into place. You think about Jesus, or how God created the world by speaking it into existence. Well, Levertov, says that peace is kind of like that for us. We have to speak it into existence and then practice it. I'll leave it at that. I thank you for your great attention and for your wonderful comments. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time to do that. And I've always been a bad judge of time. So anyway.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. What a discovery. I look forward to reading her more. Maybe we could have a little side group about her. Maybe a quiet garden morning with
Sounds
Denise.
like a plan to me.
All right. Thank you all so
Okay.
much for being here. See you in church.